We've all read the studies and heard the studies about you can have a traffic accident and one person standing in each corner of an intersection will have each a different story about it. But the reality also is that if you put all four people in the same corner, they'll each have a different version. Our expectations determine what we see. If we don't believe that there's such a thing as a yellow school bus, we could have 50 yellow school buses drive past us, and mentally, we'd explain that away as something else. Something pretending to be a school bus, or something that wasn't really yellow. And so Jesus comes to his hometown, and he suffers this syndrome that a young woman who I knew some years ago suffered, having grown up in a church where her father was pastor, and been a rebellious teenager, and having gone away to college, and come back feeling that she was called to ministry. Her congregation could not lift her up for ministry because all they could see was the rebellious teenager in the leather jacket who raised a whole lot of hell during worship and in other places. They couldn't move beyond that to see who she was today. And I don't think that's so uncommon. I can tell you most of my friends who knew me before I started in ministry have a real hard time really understanding that I could possibly do this. The struggle is to overcome it. The struggle is to be able to shed ourselves of those preconceptions, shed ourselves of those things that we've either taught or come to believe have to be the case. It's only like this. These are the rules. Polite people do this. The biggest mind opener in those kinds of things for me was the first time I went to the Middle East, where I learned that the common gestures here meant very much a different thing there. And that if one were to hitchhike in the Middle East, that would not be quite what this indicates. How do we do that? I think we do that by remaining open to possibility. We do that as much as we can by suspending judgment, by trying to get to the place where we move past externals to see people as they are. Which brings us in sort of a backward progression to Paul's letter and his talk of limitations, his thorn in the flesh. Whatever that was wasn't really so important. The truth is that I've come to learn as I've aged that we all get our thorn in the flesh sooner or later. But it wasn't until I started to develop my thorns that I came to realize and really understand what people talked about in medieval times when they made such a huge production out of suffering. And when they seemed to actually actively seek suffering as some way to enhance the spiritual life. I think that's backwards. I don't think you have to look for trouble. But I think certainly physical limitation comes, and if it's understood in the right way, it becomes an exercise in letting go of expectations, letting go of the way that we've been taught the world ought to be, that we perhaps assume life ought to be. You know, if I'm a good person, things ought to be easy. If I do the right thing, God will bless me with health. Well, if that's the case, God apparently is really upset with a whole lot of people. Just about everybody probably over the age of 40, God loses favor with God. If we start to come to that place in that limitation where we can have an exercise in suspending judgment, that maybe the way we saw things before isn't really the way they were, and that maybe there is in what appears to be a limitation an opportunity to slow down, to appreciate the things about life we didn't have the time to appreciate before. It's hard to appreciate beauty when you're working 60 hours a week. It's hard to stop and smell the roses when you're doing that. And it's also hard to listen for that still small voice inside that is God. The person who was taken up to the third heaven that Paul describes, scholars believe was Paul himself. And yet he doesn't talk about that. He talks more about those struggles that are common to our experience. Now, Paul has a dramatic side. So So like that guy at the side of the car, Paul waves his arms and carries on about what's going on. But isn't that common experience? And he found in that limitation a joy and an openness to the things that he had missed. Now, you'll never find me advocating running out and searching for pain, searching for limitation, searching for negative experience, beating yourself in the back with a whip so that you might beat the body down and let the spirit come forth. But I am saying life's going to do that to you. And to the extent that we're able to just rest in that, do what we can to alleviate our suffering, but rest in that, we look at the world anew. And then when the yellow school bus drives by, it's a yellow school bus. Then when the woman drives through the parking lot at 3 miles an hour, she really isn't out to run us over. And when in the person we least expect it, we see Jesus, we'll recognize that. Maybe even in ourselves. Amen.